What's your reference number?
I decided that one would be.
Okay, we're live, so nothing that you don't want anybody else to know about.
It's like my routing number.
Not even that bad. Nobody remembers that. But I've had people say they like the preliminary part of the shadow.
And then I just thought I got a bed, I thought, I will go. And I later what I'm thinking.
Did you hear about the accident down here? Didn't hear nothing, it was bad, wasn't it?
Chaz, you're right, it's 3 months ago.
Spencer Landscaping, Greenville. Yeah. Coming towards New Madison. Yes. Here's the driveway to the Walker House. Yes. Go right through there. Knocked down a pretty good sized tree. Yes. That tree was not in very good shape, so the trunk was shattered quite a few places. Yeah. The guy told us that might get a lot. Is he still in? Far by now. I hadn't heard of it. I thought I heard. On Walker's? When did it happen? Friday afternoon. Friday about noon. There was an accident down here on Walker's curb.
They had like 3 runs.
Spencer's Landscaping, Greenville dump truck on the road. This is the driveway going in the house. Knocked the tree down. No. About the same identification. Coming down, this is the driveway to the house. Straight through there. Knocked down a pretty good sized tree.
Is that the wreck on 121?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was blocked off when I tried to get home.
Was anyone hurt besides the tree?
Yes, sounds like it was.
This blew him out, didn't it?
I don't know.
They took it initially to Greenville, and tried transporting their own chopper, they did, she called for a chopper. But they think the closest hospital to state where
Yeah, and there's, he was, because that's our house. And well, somebody's renting the trucks, because they're every 10 minutes. He was probably looking back around her.
Well, I know, I understand the interest, but I was really.
Thomas Road. We came back around 7:30.
Yeah, what?
Well, no, they were still cleaning Spencer's trucks. There were 3 Spencer's trucks at that time. Well, not, I don't know for sure what they're doing. It's manicuring the lawn or something around there. About 7:30.
That's city responsibility.
Yeah, we get that round up now. But you know, when it rains,
I checked this out for you.
it's super complicated. And you dilute it, and you mix it into the.
That's what generally
I think
happens.
that's what Linda uses.
But yeah, you got all the work to do and everything.
You know.
I haven't heard any details on it or anything.
The worst was the blizzard of 78.
Yes.
The snow was like 12 feet deep, and they brought the front end loaders through, and they piled it all on the fence.
Yes.
Spent the fence down like almost a mile. After that, we just kind of pulled out and bent it and put the posts out and pulled it straight up again. Every time. All right, welcome to First Universalist of New Madison. Beautiful spring day, peaceful here, not everywhere. We still have our sunflowers for Ukraine. We're never going to forget them as long as that trouble goes on, which looks like it's unending. I brought today, if anybody wants to look at them, there's a book called Maus, M-A-U-S, by Art Spiegelman. It was in the news 2 or 3 months ago. It had been banned by numerous conservative school boards and school parents. and I'm not exactly sure it was supposed to be obscene, and I've gone through both. This is from the New Madison Library. I've gone through both of these, and there's some pictures of people in a gas chamber, but they're cartoon drawings, and they're about this tall. They're like one little tiny panel on the whole page, so you can't really see anything. So I'm not sure. I think the reason they're trying to get them banned is more because they're talking about prejudice, about the Holocaust, about things that people don't want their tender little children to know about. But as we all know, if you don't know about it, if you don't learn your history, you're bound to repeat the history.
You're talking about history.
Yes. And I'm kind of worried. It looks to me like even the people that know the history are going to repeat the history almost intentionally. So
I've read Mouse. It's a really compelling story. Art Spiegelman used the books to process his own experience of dealing with his father, who was a survivor of the Holocaust. And why does his dad do some of the strange things he does? And by retelling his parents' story, but with them pictured as mice.
It's a cartoon.
Or they call it graphic novel, since it's
and
more
graphic
for
novel,
older
yes.
people.
The Jews are mice, and the Germans are
Cats.
cats. That's the faces they're drawn with. And there are some other species in there, like the Poles or the people who aren't German or Jewish, do have different faces. The interesting thing was it was Art Spiegelman processing, because it's not only a history of the Holocaust as told by his father, it's also a history of Art Spiegelman's relationship with his father and his father's wife, first wife, his mother who died, the next wife, what life is like in the Jewish community. And I'm sure you've seen stories, movies, and things of the Jewish culture is a little bit different. If you've seen any of the movies, Fiddler on the Roof, that kind of thing, there's some bizarre little things that go on, little touches that Jewish mothers, I mean, we all know all the cliches, all that is covered in there. Really, really interesting, well done, not obscene in any way that I can see, for me anyway.
I found it very touching. I mean, I could tell that as Art was creating this book, that it was both him struggling with his father as well as how much he loved his dad.
And the difficulty that every family goes through. His father, when his mother died and then his second wife left him, wanted Art and his new wife to come stay with him for the summer. And it was driving them crazy, and they said, we'll stay for a weekend. So if you can imagine, interspersed throughout the book, we're leaving now. Well, you can't leave now, we have to do this, or we have to do that. It's a story of interfamily dynamics, which is also interesting, yes.
What's the background of the group trying to ban the books?
The same conservative groups in mostly southern states, but also now in Ohio and Indiana. I mean, the South is like, not only is global warming creeping north, the South is creeping north. So.
And their accusation specifically about this book is that their accusation that it has obscene depictions of nudity, but the nudity involves naked mice figures in the gas chambers.
They're in the gas chamber, they're naked. It's a panel about this big. They're stick figures. The breasts are dots, and the penises are a little tiny line. I mean, you can't even see it without a magnifying glass. And there's like one of those or two of those in each book.
But it's also historically accurate.
It is
They
historic.
were placed in the chambers naked because they thought they were being given delousing showers.
And it's not, he doesn't do this over and over. He doesn't expand on it. He doesn't make a big deal out of it. It's the picture of what happens as the wives of these numerous family members from one end to the other have all been, and then he goes through, we may do a sermon on this some Sunday. You can, if you're work for the Nazis in the German camp, there were Jews that actually worked, they were called capos. They were either Polish Jews or German Jews that worked for the Nazis to run the camps. The Nazis didn't do everything. They had their underlings that did things. If you did them favors, like he learned how to do a leather work, so he repaired somebody's boots, that guy would give him extra food because they were basically starving people to death. They would do favors for each other if you did favors for them. So there's a whole complicated thing about what is integrity, what is someone else's life worth. Are you willing to have someone else sent to the gas chamber so you can live? I mean, he deals with all of this stuff is in there, and this is the things that happened in the concentration camp. It's like a pressure cooker of human emotion, ethics, and everything else. So, if people are interested, you can look at these, look through them today afterwards. If people are interested, we'll go ahead and do a Sunday on it and really investigate it. Basically, Derek is doing Outrage only gets you so far, so our slideshow is kind of built on outrage, on anger. Our children's story is the Angry Little Dinosaur. I think you might get a kick out of that. I also have some pictures. I'll show you as we go through. So, any other announcements? Do we have any announcements? We haven't actually announced anything yet. Okay. Our prelude, More Love to Thee, O Christ, or Lord, whichever you want. More love to thee. Let's center ourselves for worship today, a day of difficulty throughout the world, and then we'll read the welcome. That'd be 429 in your hymnal if you want to follow along. Come into this place of peace, and let its silence heal your spirit. Come into this place of memory, and let its history warm your soul. Come into this place of prophecy and power, and let its vision change your heart. William F. Schultz. All right. Our chalice lighting is Determined Seed by Laura Wallace. As frozen earth holds the determined seed, this sacred space holds our weariness, our worry, our laughter, our celebration. Let us bring seed and soul into the light of thought, of the warmth of community, and the hope of love. Let us see together, hear together, love together. Let us worship. And this spring we have some daffodils, almost the end of daffodils that I've seen. If anybody has any other ones, I plant the early, middle, and late season. And this seems like pretty early to be late season, but they're disappearing fast. Okay. Opening hymn, number 34, May I Speak with the Bravest Fire. This has been a rough week for a lot of people. This doesn't really have a place in the service other than I figured that we just have to put it in here somewhere. How many of you saw the episode of the Little League Park in Carolina, South Carolina? I'm going to play that for you now. This is what happens when you have no gun control. This is what happens when angry people have guns. This is a Little League Park and a Little League game. Can you imagine being at a Little League Park with your kids and hearing more than 100 shots fired? Luckily, the kids that drove in and were shooting at each other didn't hit anybody and nobody there was shot. But what is that going to do to a 12-year-old or a 10-year-old's life? Okay, And that's how we come to the angry little dinosaur. This is our children's story.
Angry Little Dinosaur by Jade Neff. Fred was so angry. It all started when his shoelace wouldn't tie the way he wanted it to. When he pulled it too hard, it snapped. Then he had to find a new pair of shoes without laces, and someone had put them somewhere where he couldn't find them. Fred stomped around his house looking for a new pair of shoes, and the longer he couldn't find them, the angrier and angrier he got. He was stomping so angrily that he kicked his toe, and that really hurt. He let out a huge roar. It was so loud that it made the earth tremble. His parents came running from behind the big volcano where they were sleeping. "What's wrong?" they asked Fred. "Everything," said Fred. Mummy frowned. "Surely not everything, Fred." "Everything," said Fred more definitely. "Really everything?" asked Daddy. But Fred had given up answering. He sat right where he was, on a prickly bush. "Ow!" he cried, jumping up and holding his tail. And then he forgot that his own tail was prickly too, and it pricked him. "Ow!" he wailed again. "See, everything about today is bad." "It seems to me," said Mummy, "that you need to take a few big breaths. You are like that big volcano over there. The hotter you get, the more you're bubbling over. If you can close your eyes and take a few deep breaths, you will be able to cool down. And then you will be able to really watch what you're doing and think about things more calmly. I think you'll find everything will be better then." Could it really be possible? Fred decided things couldn't be any worse. He closed his eyes and relaxed his angry face. Already he felt a little bit better. And now that he was quiet, he could hear his breaths. In they came, and then out they went again. Fred could feel the air filling his body like a cool drink of water. He could feel the sun on his face, and it was warm. He noticed how he'd been feeling before, hot like a volcano. His heart had been beating fast, and his blood rushing about his body like he wanted to fight something. Now he could notice how he was safe, and how quiet everything was. And as he stood there feeling those feelings, a new idea came to him too. "I know where my shoes are now," he exclaimed. "I took them off yesterday when I went swimming in that muddy mangrove. I will go and get them." Fred walked through the forest and back to the muddy mangrove. There were his shoes waiting for him. But now that Fred felt better, he remembered how much fun it was to swim and play in that muddy mangrove. "I don't think I need my shoes at all," Fred decided. He took a run and jumped, splash, right into all that delicious mud. It was warm and nice and sloppy in the mud. Fred flopped around in it all morning, and his belly flops made the earth tremble. But this was in a much better way for everyone. The end. Thank you for reading with Storyberries.com. Free stories for kids.
Did I tell you the story when my foster kids and my kids went to the swimming in the mud bath? They didn't say what Fred's mother said when Fred got home after he jumped in the mud pit. We had a cow unfortunately die on the farm, and I took the backhoe, dug a hole right by our house. It's in the pasture because that's where she had died, and buried her. And of course, when it rains, everything kind of sags in a little bit. It made a big mud hole because it rained a lot. So my wife went to town on some kind of errand or something, and I had 3 foster kids and our 2 kids, and I'm like working, and they're out playing, and they're playing in the mud. And I say, "Well, you're getting your clothes all dirty." So they said, "Well, we'll take our clothes off, then we'll get our clothes dirty." So there's 5 kids naked, covered with mud from head to foot. When Tar got home, oh man, that was bad. Okay.
Take a deep breath, huh?
And I want to go on to that too. Take a deep breath. I don't know how many of you have tried meditation, but if you are angry, you're upset, you're nervous, if you sit down, take a deep breath and concentrate on relaxing the muscles in your big toe, then your little toe, then your foot, then your ankle, then your calf, then your thigh. If you actually concentrate and think, you can actually feel those muscles kind of sag and get loose, and as you get up to your face, you can feel those muscles in your face get loose. You actually will feel better after 3 or 4 minutes of that. Okay, our affirmation in your hymnal is 458. Mindful of truth ever exceeding our knowledge, and community ever exceeding our practice, reverently we covenant together, beginning with ourselves as we are, to share the strength of integrity and the heritage of the Spirit in the unending quest for wisdom and love. Walter Ward Jones, Jr. Okay, always great to have Derek here, and he's going to talk today on outrage.
First, my gratitude to the church down in El Dorado for releasing me to serve here this morning. I always enjoy being here as well as the drive back and forth from Richmond. It's a lovely, lovely drive and a lovely, lovely day. I have a reading to share with you. I will not tell you exactly where it comes from, at least not right away. Justice is in this day bewailing its plight, and equity groans beneath the yoke of oppression. The thick clouds of tyranny have darkened the face of the earth and enveloped the peoples. Through the movement of our pen of glory, we have, at the bidding of the omnipotent ordainer, breathed new life into human frames and instilled into each word a fresh potency. So why do you fear, my well-beloved ones? Who is it that can dismay you? A touch of moisture is sufficient to dissolve the hard clay out of which this perverse generation is molded. The mere act of you gathering together is enough to scatter vain and worthless people. So, a question for you. In what time period do you think this reading came from? I'm not asking you who wrote it, but what period of time? You can guess. We'll take a couple guesses and see how close to the target anyone gets.
1850.
1850. Other guesses?
1920.
1920.
1950.
1950. Well, ding, 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 tie was closest. The correct answer is, it was written somewhere between 1850 and 1875. The author is someone who might be a little obscure in this part of the world. His name was Baha'u'llah. He was the founder of the Baha'i faith, a religion originating in Persia, and one that has a few interesting parallels with Unitarian Universalism, and emphasis on the harmony between world religions, women's equality, peacemaking, and a unity between science and religion. There is actually a very small Baha'i congregation in Richmond. I know one person who's part of that. But they exist, they have these interesting parallels as well as differences, but that is a sermon for another day. And this is known as the Tablet of Baha'u'llah. It was written sometime between 1850 and 1875. He was a very prolific writer. He talks about his pen of glory. And it's not always easy to pin down exactly when some things were written unless he put a date on it when he wrote it. But his life and ministry, Baha'u'llah, was largely lived within the competing boundaries of the Persian Empire, where he was born, and the Ottoman Empire right across the border, where he was eventually exiled. The prophet's emphasis in this part of his writing on themes of injustice, inequality, and tyranny, it feels familiar. Even right now, it feels familiar. And in Baha'u'llah's context of location, what it meant for him was that he was witnessing the persecution of religious and political dissidents, the torture of prisoners, and at one time he was chained naked in a prison in Tehran with a manacle around his neck. Women treated as second-class persons, the chattel system as he called it, where women were technically the property of first your father and later your husband. Unjust warfare between empires. Remember, the Persians and the Ottomans, they did not like each other. And they had competing ambitions for territory that was next to each other. And state-sponsored violence against their own empire's citizens. And this all feels like a little bit familiar because while we don't live in a world of competing cruel monarchs, I feel like we live in an echo of that world. We are living even now in a world of injustice, inequality, and at the very least, with people who have ambitions that aspire towards tyrannical use of government power, as well as the tyrannical use of wealth and business power. And I feel a certain amount of outrage from time to time. I feel outrage when I read about the criminalization of medical care needed by transgender youth. I feel outrage when I see a society around me that on one hand grieves the unending stream of deaths from drug overdoses, and yet cannot muster much of any effort to intervene in ways that have much of any compassion for anyone in the throes of a drug addiction. In the past 12 months, I know of 3 young men who have died of drug overdoses. 2 from heroin, 1 from meth. 1 was a young man who had been in our youth group at El Dorado in the early 2000s. Dalton Mills, if you might remember him, should still be alive right now. I feel outrage about that. I feel outrage when I see the nation of Ukraine being invaded by Russia and Russian propaganda doggedly arguing that Russia had no choice but to invade as an act of self-defense against non-existent Nazis. The president of Ukraine is Jewish, by the way. But I want to remind you, outrage is natural. Outrage is what psychologists describe as a moral emotion. And outrage is, at some level, necessary as part of our practice of community and our ability to live as just and fair people, because it is a survival mechanism. But in the environment of the world right now, outrage is also volatile, potentially toxic, and often used unproductively. Outrage is a community-level survival mechanism, and by community level, I mean about the size of a village. An anthropologist named Colin Turnbull spent time studying a native hunter-gatherer community in the Congo. And in the village that he visited and studied, there was a man whose name was Sifu. And Sifu was ambitious. Sifu was also a cheat. And at the time when a valued species of fish would migrate downstream, the village's practice was for the village fishermen to cooperatively deploy their nets as a group at the same point in the river, and then to divide up the fish among the families in the village. Sifu, however, had a different idea. He decided to go a ways up the river alone and spread his own set of nets across a narrow point. And he caught a huge number of fish that day. And his fellow villagers downriver caught almost none. He then tried to hide his catch and not share it. But Sifu's action did not go completely unnoticed, because in a village that size, people will notice that you were not there with all the other guys who were fishing. They figured out the deception. Outrage spread through the village. Sifu was confronted by his elders, he was snubbed by his peers, and then he was ignored by most of the people in the village, which is devastating and dangerous in a hunter-gatherer society. This is one of the reasons why, deeply ingrained within us, social exclusion cuts so deeply. Because despite what we might say about our own autonomy, we really, even in a technological society, depend on one another for survival. In the face of a collective outrage from his village, Sifu confessed, gave away all his ill-gotten fish, and after that he was forgiven. And things in the village returned to normal. Outrage, Colin Turnbull observed, corrected a misdeed in Sifu's village. But Colin wondered, in our time, outrage may not be enough, and it may not be the right tool. Imagine what might happen if one of the people who discovered Sifu cheating, instead of confronting him face to face, had instead published an angry screed in a national newspaper, or, better yet, tweeted about his dishonest activities. And what if you, sitting somewhere else in the Congo, or maybe somewhere on the other side of the world, saw that letter to the editor or read the tweet? You don't know Sifu at all. You can't interact personally with him, likely ever. But some people might feel outraged about what he did. And then what? Some of those people are going to share that tweet or pass on the newspaper photo to others, and they might share it too, spreading the outrage around. And eventually, people who don't even live in Sifu's village might be calling on him to be exiled. That village over there, they need to exile that guy. He's a cheat at fishing. But it probably wouldn't be long before there would also be a backlash movement. It's Twitter, after all, defending Sifu and issuing threats against the people calling for Sifu's exile. In short, a typical day on social media in the Western world. And what would this actually achieve? Often, not that much. Not that much. Because unlike in Sifu's case, where the village could bring him back into line, our modern outrage machine, on its own, on its own, rarely corrects the moral offense. Sometimes the consequences of our modern multimedia outrage machine can even turn fatal. Some people, especially if they're wrongly targeted by the outrage machine, because it's easy to gin those things up, some people have taken their lives in response to that kind of harassment. And yet others have had their lives threatened or been murdered in the name of correcting the outrage. And the constant churning of the outrage machine leaves the rest of us feeling angry, tired, powerless, and miserable. A problem with our current multimedia environment is that the outrages we witness are very frequently far, far removed from us. And we lack the first-hand relationships to prevent the misdeeds or to reform the wrongdoer in any meaningful way. But that doesn't stop people from trying, because outrage demands satisfaction. Outrage demands satisfaction. And so we suffer from an illusion of agency. We feel that by spreading things around in the multimedia world, we are actually accomplishing something. But most of the time, we're just screaming into the void. And so we spread the outrage further and further, causing more people to become angry, tired, powerless, and miserable. A touch of moisture is sufficient to dissolve the hard clay out of which this perverse generation is molded. The mere act of you gathering together is enough to scatter vain and worthless people. The good news is that we are not slaves to our nature. This is a part of human nature that Baha'u'llah perceived in the face of injustice he was witnessing in Persia and the Ottoman Empire. A small and humble thing, a gathered, thoughtful community, can dissolve the hard clay of our own dysfunction. We are evolved to experience outrage. We are evolved to experience outrage. Do not feel ashamed or guilty if you have that feeling that comes up. But we also have an evolved capacity to consciously redirect our thinking and our actions. That is really what ethics is all about. Ethics. One of the jewels in the Universalist and Unitarian crown of faith. It's why we spend so much time in churches like this, pondering the really difficult questions of ethics. Ethics is something we as congregations ponder as preparation for our individual lives beyond these walls and our community actions as a group. Ethics encourages us to listen to the gut and then to contemplate the most constructive way of acting upon our feelings. And so here's where we arrive at the take-home message. If you forget everything else, remember this point forward. It is not wrong for you to feel outrage. But be very vigilant that you are not merely spreading the outrage around, along with the anger, exhaustion, and feelings of powerlessness that a lot of people are really struggling with. And ask yourself, what is the most constructive response, the most empowering response? For example, when I see news about the criminalization of medical care for transgender youth, I make sure that I tell people around me the facts about that kind of health care. And I direct more of my charitable giving to organizations like Lambda Legal, who use the judicial process to defend the rights of transgender people to access the health care they need. We still carry the psychological tools of our ancestors, we do. Even though they packed for a very different world than the one we live in. That toolkit was packed for village life, for hunter-gatherer life. We live in a different world, a very global world, and one in which we have access to very powerful multimedia technology. But it's within our power to deploy the tools that we inherited in different and sometimes more limited ways, and also to repack our ethical toolkit in a way that is a better fit for the world we actually live in. And that's what I encourage you to do. Be conscious about that toolkit, what you inherited and what you need to pack for today. I leave my portion of the spoken ministry with these words of prayer by the Unitarian preacher Leslie Pennington in the early 20th century. Wearied by the haste and waste of our times, we turn to you, the source of peace and strength, and we pray for the gift of a quiet mind. A little bit like the Angry Little Dinosaur.
A little bit.
A little bit. So one of the practices is not unique to this place, but it's pretty rare as churches goes. We do take some time for dialogue around the themes of the morning. And I always come away from here with some wisdom that I did not have before when I came through those doors. So what would you speak on this morning?
We commend your ability to eke out wisdom out of the common discussion.
I always get something out of here that I didn't think about that.
Well, my question would be, has outrage either diminished, disappeared, or changed? Because I really think now, in this day and age in that village, at least, well, actually, Sifu would not be intimidated at all. He would turn around and say, I'll deliver fish to your home in one day for free at a lower price than you could buy it at the fishmonger's shop. And the rest of the community would say, that man is a genius, and he would end up owning not only all the fish, but he would own all the electric cars, he would own half the stuff in the village, and people, half the village would praise him for that.
And that's what happens when you move out of the hunter-gatherer village into the current world. It gets a lot more complicated. It reminds me of reading about, quite recently, you hear the term Luddite. And a Luddite is somebody who, it's a pejorative term for somebody who rejects technology. But the actual historical Luddites were members of weaver guilds in England who freaked out when industrial factory machinery for making cloth was being installed and propagated. The thing that this essayist pointed out was, yeah, people love the idea of cheap cloth, but a lot of the things the Luddites warned people about were true. Whole sets of technological craft skills would be driven into extinction. These middle-class weaver jobs vanished and were replaced by very poorly paid factory jobs. And it became really, really hard to find good quality cloth. So yeah, I mean, it's cheap, but that outrage was there. This person wondered, in an alternate timeline, what would have happened if there had been some more cooperative relationship between those who were creating the machinery and the weavers, so that maybe there was like a spectrum of stuff available. But human nature wants the stuff cheap, is what I'm thinking about. And that's hard. And that's really hard. Because there is that resentment, which is another moral emotion.
And yet there is a division in the response to that. In Europe, they created universal health care, universal food supply, basically a universal care system for people who were pushed out of their jobs, who lost their jobs. In the United States, you have that kind of naked capitalism, where if you're technologically ousted from your job, you're told to get your own education, bring yourself up by your bootstraps, et cetera, which is not always possible.
Yeah. Mike?
With technology today, it's so easy to propagate outrage. And outrage is manufactured, propagated, and pushed forward simply to promote political agenda often.
Oh, it's a great way to manipulate people.
And so I'm not sure, an average example would be the governor's race in Virginia back last fall. Okay? The public was tired, school-age parents were tired of the mask. Is it today or tomorrow? Do we have to? We don't have to? I'm not going to. And that frustration was turned into, do you know what your schools are up to? I.e., they might be teaching critical race theory, or they may be teaching inappropriate grade levels, sex education. That governor won, despite the fact, it was my understanding, that that candidate won the governorship when he was actually the underdog compared to the incumbent. But it was manufactured outrage, and that outrage simply played out in every school district, and those individuals who weren't quite sure of public education and whatever else, they got on board and they got other people on board, and he won the governor's race. Now, I don't know whether he's continuing that agenda or it has sort of faded into the woodwork, but it was outrage. We see it playing out today in Ohio, House Bill 347, and similar outrages. Do you know what an organization, usually schools or other institutions, state government, deep state, do you know what they're up to? And you should be outraged at that. Often carried forth also with conspiracy theories.
Oh, and numerous inaccuracies, or things taken out of context. If we go back to the book banning thing we talked about, there was a novel that was banned, and I heard an interview with the author of it, and at the school board meeting, there was a parent who read a little excerpt, but it was an excerpt taken out of context, and the character in the novel, who is a teenage girl, makes the statement, "I've never had sex unless I was high on drugs." And that was the only thing you heard. Which made it sound like this novel was a voyage of debauchery. But the author said that this novel she wrote was a tragedy about someone who ran away from home and who was an addict, and the regret she felt. She had, if that person at the school board meeting had only read one more page forward, she would have also heard the character talking about, "I wonder if I can ever go home, and I wonder if anyone will love me." The whole context of her novel was presented as something completely other than what it was. That it was this tragic and then redemption story of overcoming addiction. The outrage thing is really easy. And I can't control other people, but I can choose to step away from the outrage machine. When I have relatives who send me emails with things that I think are inaccurate or provocatively graphic, I choose not to send that onward. I may acknowledge it, or even if it's accurate, I may try to tamp down the outrage and say, "Oh, that's really awful. Maybe we should do something like donate to this, or take part in that peaceful protest, or let me know if you want me to write a letter to my congressman. Could do that. It's not as sexy or energetic to turn the energy down and then actually do something. And a lot of the doing is not as easy as it was in the village stage. It's not. There are things in the world I have no power. I have no power over the war in Ukraine. The best I can manage is to send money to relief agencies.
I would say we do have power if we would use it. Outrage is what stimulates people to vote.
Mm-hmm.
And if the people who are pro-Putin, which there are unbelievably people who come out and speak in favor of Russia, American politicians, I cannot conceive of how this is happening. The people who support those people come out and vote in droves. And if the people who do not support those people don't vote in opposition, then things in the midterms coming up are going to be very dark.
Again, outrage is a variety of anger. Anger is not automatically bad. Anger is a healthy, normal emotion when there is a boundary violation, or even if you witness a boundary violation. It's what we do with that after we have that feeling. Because anger can, if we just wallow in it and spread it around indiscriminately, can take us to some really awful places. But yeah, I mean, I would want you to feel anger.
Chandler.
For a moment.
Yes.
And then move it in a constructive direction. Use it as when I experience anger, I view it as my emotions saying, hey, there is a boundary violation going on here. This is something to pay attention to. As opposed to it's a call for me to, I don't know, go to my spouse and try to provoke him to be even more angry than me. Well, thank you, friends.
Good discussion. That's what we're here for. Okay, our offering. It had to be you, and as always, feel free to put something in. If you need something, take something out.
And fish.
Oh, this first Sunday, yes, fish. And the fish thing is
Here, fishy.
right there.
It's there.
There is a fish to put your fish in. is. This is a wolf's angle, or wolf trap, wolf hook. This is just to show you that there is complications in everything. When Putin says Ukraine has Nazis, this is the Azov regiment or the Azov battalion, which is in Mariupol. If you've heard about the surrounded town on the southern end with the factory that's being surrounded, the Ukrainian soldiers who are in there defending that town are the Azov battalion. They are neo-Nazis. They are against gay people, they're against all kinds of things. But when the Russians invaded Ukraine, everybody who was willing to fight the Russians was invited into the Ukrainian military. So their little private militia group became nationalized, basically. This is their symbol, this is their flag. They stand for Ukraine, but they stand for a different Ukraine than a lot of other people would be supportive of. So when we do the thing on Nazism, on the Holocaust, we'll do a little more on the Azov or the Azov regiment. Okay, our closing hymn is 114. Good one. there we have the contradiction of our times. We pray for peace, we move for peace, we work for peace, and we sing a slightly militaristic hymn. All right, extinguishing the chalice is 694 in your hymnal. May the love which overcomes all differences, which heals all wounds, which puts to flight all fears, which reconciles all who are separated. Feel free to read along. Be in us and among us, now and always. Frederick Gillis. All these readings, everybody is more than welcome to read along. My cadence might be different. It'll all come out the same in the end. There's leftover donuts, coffee cake, cookies, all kinds of stuff back there. We'll hope Kroger has something cheap next week. Postlude, Tiptoe Through the Tulips by Herbert Boutros Ghali. Anybody know who that is?
Tiny Tim.
Tiny Tim, yes. Tiny Tim, R.I.P., died in 96. I looked it up. Does anybody have any joys and concerns? It's never too late to care for others. I have a concern. I have 3 Subaru Bajas, and all 3 of them are busted. How can that happen? And one of the most interesting thing is when they're from 2005, I went to get parts off the old one for the other one that I'm driving. Unbelievably, the parts on the other one are just as bad as the parts on this one. And I called the junkyard, and their parts are just as bad as the parts on the 2 I've got. So I have to go to Advance Auto and get brand new parts.
Sounds like it was a bad year for Subaru.
Actually, Subaru has had good years all the way along. I mean, that's a 2005, and it's lasted this long. The one I have has 450,000 miles on it. It's still running. So I'm not criticizing Subaru. I'm criticizing rust.
One part.
Yeah, it's the brake. It's the brake assembly. And they're all rusted and tight and won't work. So that finishes our service, New Madison Universalist. Glad to have you here. I say this every week, and people, I hope you're paying attention. The virus is still out there. You need to wear your mask when you're out in public. You don't see it anymore, but the rate of incidence is increasing. All right.
Good.